Hello, thanks for joining us. Coming up on today's show.
A novel set in Soviet Russia in an era of austerity, in which the hero spends 3 decades in the confines of a single building. What a perfect opportunity for Towles to investigate the depths of the Russian soul.
It's a best-selling book that's on Barack Obama's favourites list. It chronicles a Russian aristocrat who spends 30 years imprisoned in a Moscow hotel. Translated into 20 languages, the second novel from Wall Street director of research turned successful author Amor Towles is to be turned into a TV series. Is in Paris as a Gentleman in Moscow is being translated into French. Amor, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Pleasure to have you. Now, A Gentleman in Moscow chronicles 32 years in the life of a Russian aristocrat who's arrested during the revolution. He's saved from execution due to a poem that he'd written, and he's sentenced to permanent house arrest in servants' quarters of Moscow's Metropole Hotel.
Yeah.
This is a fabulous idea. Where did you get it?
Well, I don't know about a fabulous, but I have written fiction since I was a child. But I did spend 20 years in the investment business, as you said, and I used to, for my firm, spend a week in a hotel in Los Angeles every year, a week in a hotel in London, a week in a hotel in Paris. And one year I was arriving at my hotel in Geneva for the 8th year in a row. And when I walked into the lobby, I recognized some of the people from the year before. And I thought, it's as if they had never left. And in the elevator on the way upstairs, I thought, actually, that's kind of an interesting idea for a story. What if you had someone who was trapped in a hotel for a long period of time? And my instinct immediately was that if I was going to take a protagonist and trap him in a hotel, he shouldn't be there by preference. He should be there by force. And that made me think of Russia, as a small leap of the imagination there. And then right away, I knew that I wanted to set the story in the Metropole Hotel, which is right across, around the corner from the Kremlin.
The Count Alexander Rostov is an educated, kind man. He loves food, music, and literature.
Right.
How much of him is you? Are you a gentleman?
No, my wife wishes I were more like the Count in the course of the story. He is an invention, but he is a representation for me of a series of 19th century values that were really shared throughout Europe in the educated classes. In the 19th century, the aristocracy of Russia wasn't very different from the aristocracy of France or England. They shared a great deal in common, sort of common cultural landmarks and common values. And so he's sort of a representation of that 19th century sensibility, which of course is being turned upside down by the Soviet era.
And you name your hero Rostov. Now, the Rostovs were one of the families featured in Leo Tolstoy's novel War and Peace. At one point, he actually picks up a book in the story and he begins to read, all happy families are alike. Each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. Yeah. That's Anna Karenina.
Correct.
Also by Tolstoy. For people watching, which Russian novel would you recommend?
Well, I do think that War and Peace is my favorite of the great 19th century Golden Age Russian books. The sweep of it, it has everything. It has romance, it has history, it has philosophy, it has the excitement of the battle scenes. It's obviously a long book, but it is one which I remember vividly in my early 20s being very happy to get home from work in order to get another 3 chapters, to read another 3 chapters. But that still remains my favorite of the great Russian novels.
Well, the Count develops some deep relationships with guests in the hotel. He has an ongoing romance. He eventually becomes a head waiter. Yeah. Let's take a look at the book's teaser now.
In the hotel's kitchen, 3 collaborators convene in order to connive, conspire, and cook. Knives are juggled, passports are stolen, disguises are donned.
So we see there the Count lives in the hotel and for 3 decades. During this time, much change is going on in the outside world.
Absolutely.
And with famines, upheavals, the Second World War, the Stalinist era. How did you bring that in?
And I think that was one of the biggest challenges of the book, is you have a character who is trapped in a luxurious hotel. And so what happens is what is going on outside the walls of the hotel, which is obviously some of the most challenging decades for the Russian citizen, that news of that and the experience of those difficult events are brought into the hotel by the people the Count knows. His childhood friend, who's a poet, who is an idealist and is ultimately comes under pressure from the police and ends up doing time in prison. So you get a visit from him, and he brings, in essence, news of what's going on outside, the various guests who come through the hotel, the political figures who spend time at the hotel.
And the setting of Russia is such a fascinating one. We recently had the writer Marcel Theroux on the show. His latest novel, The Secret Books, takes the reader on a trip through 19th century France and Russia. Here he is talking about why Russia is so interesting for writers.
Russia seems to have been condemned to suffer the biggest swings of fortune of any nation. It's gone from autocracy to chaos to a terrible totalitarian regime, then chaos again in the 90s. It was finding its way out of communism, and then once again an autocratic leader in power. It's like it has to experience the biggest contrasts that are possible for any people to experience. So I think that's why writers are drawn to it. It's like a terrible experiment that's been conducted on an entire people.
One of the interesting things about Russia, we look in terms of the history of the West, is that when the First World War began, it was the most backward of all the great Western nations, by far, with 95% illiteracy and 85% of the population as peasants. In the aftermath of the war, with the revolution, the Bolsheviks became committed to modernizing Russia at a rapid pace. So in the course of a few decades, you suddenly become an industrial power, where women are in the workforce, where the society has been secularized. So he's right. I think it is kind of a very attractive realm in which to study the evolution of ideas, to study the impact of ideas on a people, to study the rapid changes that occurred in the 20th century throughout the West.
And the Football World Cup is taking place in Russia at the moment. There's been much controversy about that. Will the fact that the World Cup is taking place in Russia improve the country's reputation around the world?
I don't know about improve the reputation. We hope, of course, since the beginning of the Olympics, we wish that sports were occurred outside of the realm of politics. That was sort of the whole idea of the World Cup or the Olympics. And what we've seen is that they too have ultimately can be politicized. And I'm sure that we're going to see a lot of political controversy around those events.
Now, Russia has a rich culture of writers, of artists and musicians. You've said that you think writing is very similar to writing a symphony.
Yes.
Why?
The novel in particular, for me, if you think of the various art forms, what a symphony tends to have has a series of movements. You have themes which are played over the course of the movements by different instruments, with at times in a very moving or sorrowful way, at times filled with joy and full of volume. And a novel is doing a similar thing. It's taking the story over the course of a series of movements. The tempo is changing, the mood is changing, but there are motifs that recur. And then ideally, at the conclusion of a symphony or the novel, you want that feeling of when you've read the last page to sort of say, yes, that's it. It is over. It is perfect. And that's certainly what I strive for. You don't always achieve that, but you want that complexity, the shifting of ideas, the shifting of tone, the shifting of sentiments, but ultimately a feeling that it has all come together at the right moment.
Let's have a listen now to some music that you reference in the book. So Rakhmaninov, Tchaikovsky, Mozart. Tell us about these choices.
Yeah. As the Count is an aristocrat sort of raised out of the 19th century sensibility, he is a lover of fine music, but ultimately he's asked to keep an eye on a young girl whose parents are off stage, and she takes his love of music.
This individual is actually inspired by your own daughter, isn't she?
Well, yes, that's true. My daughter was, there's a 5-year-old girl in the book, there's a 9-year-old girl in the book, and that's not a coincidence. My daughter was 5 when I had the idea for the novel, she was 9 when the novel was done, and she's definitely the person who taught me how shrewd a young girl can be. They're very smart. They're not to be underestimated in any way. And so, yes, the young girls in the book are very sort of willful and smart on their own.
And this is your second novel set in the first half of the 20th century.
That's true, yeah.
Rules of Civility was published in 2011. It was translated into, I think, 17 languages. Yes. It won a big prize, the Prix Fitzgerald here in France.
That's right.
It's also being made into a film this time. Can you talk to us about this interest in this period.
Yep. I don't think all of my books will be set in that period, but I'm attracted to roughly 70 years ago. And the reason I'm attracted to 70 years ago is because most of us have no firsthand experience with the world 70 years ago. But on the other hand, most of us have some sense of what the world was like 70 years ago. And when I can take my readership and I know that they have some familiarity but no personal experience, that gives me a lot of freedom. Because I can put some landmarks that they'll recognize from the time, which will give them confidence that they know what's happening, but then I can start to invent things very quickly, and they won't quite know as a reader which is a true fact and which is a made-up fact. And that's true in the course of The Gentleman in Moscow. There are many elements which are drawn directly from the historical chronicles of the Soviet era, but there are many things which are entirely made up. And I leave it to the reader to try to figure out which is which.
A Gentleman in Moscow is out in French in August.
Yep.
Tell us about your next projects.
My next book is about 3 18-year-old boys who are on their way from the Midwest in the United States to New York City in 1954, and that's about all I would tell you about it.
Okay, well, we're going to end, Amor, with your cultural pick.
Yeah.
What have you chosen for us?
What I've recently enjoyed greatly is the television series Fargo. You know, the Coen brothers are really two of the finest filmmakers in America, and they made that terrific movie with Steve Buscemi called Fargo. And what it's been done is taken by an auteur television creator and turned into an extended series. Each year is a totally different set of characters. Takes place in a different year with different fashion and different music. But in each case, it's sort of a crime-driven story where there's incredible inventiveness to the storytelling and to the cinematic art that is playing out. Once you start, I guarantee you, if you're watching it, it's one of those things you'll want to watch all 3 seasons over the course of a weekend. You will not feed your family.
Okay, Amor, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Remember our website. We're also on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. There's more news coming up on France 24 after this.
I got a place that needs a little robbing.
Cool.
What did you do?
You need a ring.
That is so romantic.
That's sweet. They're coming. Pitchfork peasants with murder in their eyes.
Why don't you start from the beginning?
This fella comes in.
It wants a case of frozen orange juice concentrate, which... Can you make meth from that?
Not last I heard.